In 1933, at the peak of the Great Depression, more than 200,000 American farms went into foreclosure in a single year. That works out to roughly one farm lost every 2.5 minutes, around the clock, every day, for 12 straight months. Families who had worked the same land for decades watched strangers bid on their equipment, their livestock, their homes, and the numbers kept climbing. The average foreclosure rate between 1913 and 1920 was 3.2 per 1,000 farms. By 1926, it had jumped to 17.4. By 1933, it reached 38.8 per 1,000 farms. That is not a gradual decline. That is a collapse. And it did not hit everyone equally. Some families lost everything. Their neighbors, sometimes on the very same road, kept their land. And for a long time, the easy explanation was that the families who survived just hated debt, that they were more frugal, more careful, more disciplined. But when you look at the actual documents, the court records, the federal legislation, the local newspaper accounts, the real story is more specific than that, and more surprising. Because the families who held on were not always the ones who paid the most. In several documented cases, they were the ones who understood exactly what they had to pay and what they were legally allowed to delay. There was a rule, not always called by that name, not always written on a single page, but a rule nonetheless. And by the end of this video, you will understand it precisely, including one case from Iowa where a father of 5 kept his farm by paying just $30 a month, and why that number was not a coincidence. We are going to go through 3 layers of this story. First, what actually made certain families structurally less vulnerable when everything collapsed. Second, how a specific piece of federal law, signed on May 12, 1933, essentially codified that survival logic into a legal mechanism. And third, the case of Arthur Nagle, an Iowa farmer whose court record from 1935 shows the rule in action, down to the dollar, down to the condition, down to the clause that saved his family from losing the farm. The last part of that story has a detail that almost nobody talks about, and it changes how you understand the whole thing. So stay with me. Let us start with what actually separated the families that survived from the ones that did not, because the answer is not what most people assume. About 2/5 of all American farmers were holding a mortgage during this period, and nearly 3/4 required credit just to produce a crop from year to year. So debt itself wasn't the dividing line. Almost everyone had some. The dividing line was equity. Specifically, how much of the farm's value the family still owned free and clear when prices started falling. Here is why that mattered so much. When farm income collapsed and crop prices cratered, the value of the land itself fell too. Farm income dropped by roughly 60%, and cash proceeds from marketing farm products in 1932 were dramatically lower than they had been in 1919. So a family that had borrowed heavily against a farm, valued at, say, $10,000, suddenly found themselves with a farm worth maybe $4,000 or $5,000, and a debt that had not shrunk at all. The equity that was supposed to protect them had evaporated. The families who had kept their borrowing conservative, who had not refinanced and expanded every time land values went up in the 1920s, still had something left. They had a cushion. And that cushion was not just emotional comfort. It was legal leverage. Because when a lender looked at a farm where the debt was still well below the land's current depressed value, there was still a viable path to work out a deal. When the debt exceeded the value of the land, there was almost nothing left to negotiate with. Farm mortgage debt in the United States had risen from $3.2 billion in 1910 to $9.6 billion by 1930. That expansion happened during a long run of good years, and it felt reasonable at the time. But it left millions of families exposed to exactly the kind of collapse that came. The families who had resisted that expansion, who had treated their equity as something worth protecting rather than something to borrow against, entered the Depression with a structural advantage that had nothing to do with luck. Now here is where the story gets more complicated. And this is the part that most accounts skip over entirely. Keeping your equity intact was necessary, but it was not sufficient, because even a family with solid equity could lose their farm if they tripped over the wrong clause in their mortgage. And this is where the federal law of May 12, 1933 becomes so important. The Emergency Farm Mortgage Act, enacted in May 1933, set up two separate but tightly coordinated programs to address a rising wave of farm mortgage loan defaults. One was run through the federal land banks, and the other through a new land bank commissioner. Together, the footprint of these programs was large. About 2/5 of the nation's farm mortgage loans were owned by the federal land banks and the land bank commissioner at their peak in the 1930s. But the most important thing the law did was not the lending. It was the prioritization. Section 24 of the Act reduced interest rates on certain federal land bank loans to no more than 4.5% for 5 years. And then it added something that most histories gloss over. During that same 5-year window, no portion of the principal had to be paid at all, as long as the borrower was not in default on any other condition of the mortgage. Read that again, because it is the core of the rule. You did not have to pay down the principal. You had to pay the taxes, keep the insurance current, maintain the buildings, and stay inside the terms of the contract. Do those things, and the principal could wait. Fail any one of them, and the protection evaporated. That is the rule. Not avoid debt, not pay everything off as fast as possible. The rule was, know which obligations trigger foreclosure and protect those first. The families who understood this, whether they understood it intuitively before the Depression or learned it through the federal programs during it, had a completely different experience than the families who did not. A militant farmers organization called the Farmers Holiday Association formed to block roads and keep produce from reaching markets. It was an occasionally violent form of a farmers' strike, and the association formed its own militia. That was one response to the crisis. The families in this story chose a different one. They negotiated, they prioritized, and they stayed inside the rules that kept the bank from moving against them. And they were not alone in this approach. Across the country, local farm debt adjustment committees were working county by county to broker exactly these kinds of arrangements between farmers and their creditors. The committees had no legal power to force anyone to do anything. They worked entirely through voluntary agreements. And yet, in just 10 months of documented activity, from September 1935 to June 1936, these committees handled more than 33,000 cases of debt reduction, cutting the outstanding balances by an average of more than 25%. That is roughly $26 million in negotiated relief, achieved without a single courtroom order. In Yamhill County, Oregon, a local newspaper reported in January 1934 that the county's Farm Debt Adjustment Committee was focused primarily on cases where an old debt was simply too large for the new federal refinancing to cover. The committee's job was to get the original creditor to accept enough of a reduction that the new federal loan could close. In Craig County, Oklahoma, similar committees were negotiating debt reductions and then using the freed-up cash to pay off delinquent property taxes. Because unpaid taxes were a separate threat that could destroy a family's title to the land, even after the mortgage was resolved. This is the thing that almost nobody realizes. The mortgage was not the only weapon the system had against a struggling farm family. Taxes could do it too, and so the families who truly survived were not just managing one debt. They were managing a hierarchy of obligations, making sure that the most dangerous ones, the ones that could trigger an immediate legal action, were handled first, even if it meant letting other things wait. Which brings us to Arthur Nagle. And this is the story I promised you at the beginning. Arthur Nagle had lived on an 80-acre farm near Des Moines in Polk County, Iowa, for about 23 years. He and his wife owned a third of the property. His 5 children, 4 of them minors, owned the other 2/3. In December 1931, the family mortgaged the property for $6,500, not a reckless amount for a working farm. But by 1934, income had collapsed. The drought had devastated the 1934 harvest across much of Iowa, and foreclosure was decreed against the Nagle farm on May 8, 1934. At that point, Arthur Nagle had a few options. He could walk away. He could fight the foreclosure directly, or he could try to buy time. He tried to buy time, and he almost succeeded in a different way, because he had actually secured a commitment for a $7,500 loan from the Federal Land Bank, which would have been enough to refinance the whole situation. But the loan fell through, not because of the finances, because of a legal technicality tied to the guardianship of his minor children, who were co-owners of the property. The paperwork could not be completed in a way that satisfied the court's requirements for protecting the children's interest in the land. So the refinancing failed. The foreclosure decree stood, and Arthur Nagle went to court to ask for an extension of his redemption period, the window of time after a foreclosure judgment during which a farmer could still reclaim the property by settling the debt. The Iowa Supreme Court confirmed the extension on June 21, 1935, and the terms of that extension are worth reading carefully, because they are the rule made concrete. Nagle would pay $30 per month. That money would go first to property taxes and then to interest. He would maintain insurance on the buildings. He would keep the fences and structures in good repair, and he would be allowed to retain enough of the farm's income to purchase feed and seed, because the court recognized something that creditors often refuse to see. A farm that cannot buy seed in the spring is a farm that produces nothing in the fall, and a farm that produces nothing is worth less to everyone, including the bank. The court's reasoning was almost counterintuitive by the standards of the time. Demanding more money from Nagle immediately would not have helped the creditor. It would have destroyed the farm's productive capacity, which was the only real source of recovery for anyone involved. So the court set the monthly payment low enough that the operation could survive. $30, first to taxes, then to interest. Everything else, the principal, the larger debt, could wait. That is the rule. Preserve the conditions that keep the foreclosure from being triggered. Protect the taxes. Protect the insurance. Keep the land productive. Let the principal wait. And the families that understood this logic, whether they learned it from a lawyer, a neighbor, a federal program, or hard experience, had a fundamentally different chance of surviving than the families who did not. Now, I want to tell you about one more case, because it shows the other side of this story. The side where the rule did not apply, not because the family failed to follow it, but because of something they never could have anticipated. In Nevada, 4 siblings named Palma, Aurelio, Henry, Lua, and Angela were running a farming operation in Eureka County. They had declared assets of roughly $45,000 against liabilities of nearly $140,000. They were deeply underwater. They had applied to a federal Farm Debt Adjustment Committee. They had filed for protection under the relevant federal statute, and the court denied them everything. The reason? The judge determined that the Palma family's primary activity was raising sheep on a commercial scale, 6,500 sheep, valued at $25,000. And in the legal distinction between farming and ranching that applied in that region, the Palmas were ranchers. The federal protections available to farmers did not cover them. Their petition was dismissed for lack of jurisdiction. The same rule that saved Arthur Nagle's family did not apply to the Palmas, not because of their debt level, not because of their behavior, but because of how a judge defined their occupation. The difference between keeping the land and losing it could come down to a single word in a legal filing. That is the full picture. The families who kept their farms were not simply the ones who hated debt. They were the ones who had enough equity to still have options when prices fell. They were the ones who understood which obligations triggered foreclosure and protected those first. They were the ones who could access federal programs that suspended principal payments while keeping other conditions intact. And in some cases, they were the ones whose lawyers knew exactly how to classify their operation in a court filing. The families who lost their farms were not always reckless. Some were unlucky. Some were over-leveraged from the boom years of the 1920s. Some tripped over a tax bill they could not pay. Some, like the Palmas, were simply on the wrong side of a legal definition. But the families who survived had something in common. They treated the farm not as a debt to be paid, but as a system to be kept alive. They paid what kept the debt from taking the farm. And in the worst economic collapse in American history, that distinction was the difference between everything and nothing. If this kind of history, real families, real documents, real decisions under pressure, is what you want more of, hit subscribe and drop a comment below telling me which part of this surprised you most. The Nagle case and the $30 rule. The federal law that let farmers skip principal payments for 5 years, or the Palma family, who did everything right and still lost. I read every comment, and your answers genuinely shape what I cover next. There is another story connected to this one that goes even deeper, about what happened in North Dakota when the governor himself stepped in to stop foreclosures by executive order, and the letters that flooded his office from creditors, lawyers, and desperate farm families all in the same week. That video is already up, and it picks up right where this one ends.